Hello everyone. So in this lecture titled Key Principles of Disaster Risk Management of Cultural Heritage, we will be really talking about what are the key considerations that we must keep in mind while we develop disaster risk management plans for our heritage sites. I am Rohit Jikyasu, I am project manager at ECROM. Now, disasters are very much frequent, and we keep on learning about new disasters every day from the news. And as was mentioned by the head of the National Disaster Management Agency from Indonesia, there are actually almost 127 floods, 3 landslides, 2 tornadoes, all of them in the month of January this year. So this just shows how many disasters we are confronted with, and of course these are having devastating impacts on our lives in many ways. And definitely, cultural heritage is also impacted. As you see in this case, in central Mexico, when in 2017 a big earthquake affected the central part of Mexico City and damaged many important cathedrals and other heritage buildings. So, another example is from Nepal, where again an earthquake in 2015 damaged many heritage sites, and some of them, like this one, was even on the World Heritage List. So we know that disasters can have impact on many sites that are very important not only for the countries but also for the entire world. Uh, Moving from earthquakes to other kind of disaster, let's look at fire. And you know about this major event that happened in Paris in 2019, and fire damaged Notre Dame Cathedral, which is one of the landmark buildings of the city of Paris. And it was a big challenge to restore a part of this roof and many other important elements that collapsed due to fire. Another example of fire is the National Museum of Brazil in Rio, where the fire actually damaged many collections and also had a big impact on the building itself, which was also of great historic value. So then let's look at other disaster, and here I talk about floods, which also affected many heritage sites. And here I just give an example from Eastern Europe, where floods kind of damaged many historic cities, and the effect was long lasting. So another example I give is from flooding in Paris, where the Louvre Museum was affected. And again, you would see that water entered right in the forecourt of this very important museum, and they needed to evacuate a lot of collections from the basement, and it was one of the largest evacuation ever that happened after the World War. So because of these disasters, we are now challenged with doing things that we have no experience in the past, and we need to really be very much concerned about these issues. So one of the things that we need to also keep in mind is that disasters are happening more frequent and are of much higher intensity, especially those that are affected by climate. So take this example. This is just to illustrate how many floods, storms, drought, and extreme temperature events have occurred over last few years from 1980 to 2011, and we can really see that many of these events are really increasing in their number and intensity. So, of course, we have to then think about how climate change related disasters are going to have an impact on cultural heritage. And just to give you one example, in Leh in India, where many of these adobe constructions, which were very much attuned to the local climatic conditions, which were more dry and cold, are now confronted because of the changing weather, where there is much more rainfall, and these adobe constructions are really not able to respond to this changing environmental conditions. And this is the issue that is confronted by cultural heritage in many parts of the world, where the materials and the construction techniques are not able to cope with these changing environmental parameters. So now you all know what's going on now, and there is a major event that is unfolding in Canada, where in British Columbia there are huge fires that have engulfed entire region, and one of the villages is also kind of almost lost because of these fires. And these kind of disasters are even more than ever before because of the climate change related events, where extreme temperature triggers these kind of fires, and we know that this kind of fires have occurred not only here but also in Australia, in New Zealand, and many parts of the world. Fires are not just affecting the forests or the bushes, but also many heritage sites are located in forested areas. So those cultural sites are also affected because of fires. And this is just to give you one example from Parthenon in Greece, where in 2007 bushfires had just engulfed the entire hill on which the monument was located. So when we think about disasters affecting natural sites, there is a big correlation with the cultural sites, and we need to look at these kind of interconnections between natural and cultural sites. Now, let's look at the other kind of event, which is maybe not so much momentary or so much catastrophic at an instance, like flooding or an earthquake, but these events are happening much more frequently and are at much higher pace. For example, sea level rise, which is in fact really seen in many parts of the world, and many heritage sites that are located along the coastal areas, as in this case in the Jamestown Island in the United States. This heritage site is at high risk, and it is projected that in next 50 years a large amount of this site will be underwater. So this is the kind of a challenge or the risk that many heritage sites are facing. Sea level rise, we may think of it happening in the long term, but 50 years is not really a very long time period in that big time horizon. So we also are having lots of examples where soil erosion is increasing, and many of these heritage sites are also facing much more erosion due to strong winds. And this is just to give one example where this kind of strong, higher rate of erosion is really affecting this very important site in Scotland. So again, we see that many of these slow but cumulative events are really increasing at a much higher pace, and consequently cultural heritage is at much higher risk. Well, there are also a lot of indirect impacts because of climate change, which may not be really affecting cultural heritage directly, but because people's livelihoods sometimes are at stake. So, like in this case of Mongolia, where a lot of these archaeological sites are being looted because people are no longer able to survive with their normal livelihoods, because there's much less rainfall, and so they are not able to have enough crops or enough fodder for the cattle, and because of these changing livelihood conditions, they resort to, or they are forced to resort to looting or excavating these structures and selling them. So we see such kind of issues as well, which are probably going to be indirectly affecting our cultural heritage. Now we are all confronting one major global challenge today, that is the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course it is an issue of virus, but we also need to understand that this is also connected, and there are many studies that have shown that this is linked to what climate change is doing and how it is coming together with urbanization, because of which animals' habitats have changed, and it is also affecting how they live, where they live, and who eats whom. And because of these conditions, we are now facing a pandemic, and so we need to understand these connections and know how these kind of issues are linked, and also of course cultural heritage is affected by this pandemic. As we see from this situation, we are now in a situation where many of these sites got abandoned because there were no visitors who could go, and that led to a lot of loss of revenues and other kind of issues that we had never thought in before. So how would cultural heritage and climate change connect together? What would be the impact on cultural heritage because of climate change? As I mentioned, there is going to be much more flooding, less frequent but very heavy rainfall. So there might be long periods when there is no rainfall, but then a few days with very heavy rainfall, and that may trigger other kind of disasters like landslides. It will also we will also face heritage sites uh, confronting challenged by forest fires, which especially those that are located in extreme dry areas. And some of the sites may get submerged in sea, as I mentioned earlier, and then it will have an impact on people, and many of these sites will get abandoned, and so many of those traditions or intangible practices may not be able to be carried, and so that also needs to be taken into account. Uh, of course, cultural heritage is affected indirectly because of conflicts as well, which are sometimes triggered by climate change when there are much less resources available, for example, water. And there have been instances where shortage of water has led to conflicts, and that, of course, affects cultural heritage because of exploitation, looting, and there are several examples to illustrate that as well. Impacts on traditional livelihoods, as I mentioned earlier in that example, which are dependent on natural resources. And so we need to really look into all these issues which are affecting cultural heritage because of climate change. Now I'm going to talk about 10 key principles for disaster risk management of heritage. And these principles you must keep in mind. First of all, when we think about disaster risk management for heritage, we have to think about not just the built form or the built heritage, but also look at the link with the people and the environment and how culture and nature sit together. And so when we think of risks that are confronting heritage, we should think about all these three elements that constitute any heritage site. Now, take the case of Red Fort, Old Fort in Delhi. And here you see that when there is a risk to this site, it is affected because of the moat around the fort, which is affecting these walls. But there are also risks which are confronted because of to the buildings which are inside this fort, to the landscape areas, and also both the unexcavated areas and also the excavated areas. And also, when we think about disaster risk, we don't have to think only about these components of the site, but we need to also think about the museum, which is located inside these sites, and many of these risks will be interconnected. And so, when we think of the risks to the museum, we need to think about the building in which the museum is located, and also those collections that are housed in it, housed in the museum. And when we think of the risk to museum, it means that we need to think of the building and its surroundings, the shelves or the boxes in storage and display, the collections themselves, and also visitors or the staff of those museums. So that brings me to the first principle, which is that we should consider reducing risks to all the components of cultural heritage, which will be tangible and intangible, movable and immovable, that are part of the site or the museum that we are looking at. Now, coming to this example from the Great Japan earthquake and tsunami in 2011, we know that many things happened in this disaster. Earthquake triggered tsunami, and then that led to flooding, that also led to fires in the oil refinery, and also created another major disaster, which was the nuclear accident which happened. So what did this disaster tell us? That disasters are not simply earthquakes or floods or fires, but they are very complex in their nature. And we need to kind of understand how many events connect with each other and how they unfold. So earthquake, tsunami, fire, flooding, nuclear accident. We need to look at all these events, how they lead from one to the other and combine together to create this kind of complex crisis situation. And another example from Zanzibar, which is a World Heritage City. Again, you have sea level rise, which is more triggered by climate change with increased frequency of cyclones, triggering flooding and fire. And so this creates another complex crisis situation for which this important heritage site, which is on the World Heritage List, is being impacted. Okay, so disasters are collaborating better than we are, and that's why we need to look at how these different kind of events are not to be seen in isolation, whether it's climate related, whether we're talking about pandemic, whether we talk about conflict, or even the economic crisis, but they are all kind of interconnected with each other, and we need to kind of understand how they work together, or how one leads to the other and kind of creates this cumulative effect. So that leads me to principle 2, which is that we need to take into account multiple events, especially those that can happen in parallel or follow each other. And these are not disasters. So let's not call these earthquakes or floods or fires as disasters. These are simply hazards or events that can trigger a disaster. So now I move to another example from Myanmar, where there was a big earthquake in 2016, and that affected this very important site, which is now on the World Heritage List, and many of these pagodas or these monuments were damaged. Now, when one looked at the reasons for this damage of these monuments, one actually figured out that the damage was not just because of earthquake, but it was because a lot of interventions that were done in the past created kind of conditions where the structures were not really good to respond to an earthquake forces. And that led to the kind of destruction of these. So it was not really the earthquake itself, but it was this kind of interventions that were done in the past that led to this kind of a damage. So this leads me to another principle, which is that disaster risks do not merely result because of these catastrophic events, whether they are earthquakes or fires, but there are underlying physical, social, economic, institutional, and attitudinal factors that create disaster risks and magnify them. So because there were kind of weaknesses or challenges in the structure in Myanmar because of the past interventions, which I would call as really the physical kind of weakness or physical factor, we need to understand those factors in order to be able to really respond to them. Now, it's not only physical, but we also need to look at other elements. For example, there may not be enough financial resources available, and that may create a situation where we may be forced to not have enough measures in place to reduce disaster risks. It might be that the institutions are not properly facilitated, or institutions don't have the proper systems to govern, and that may lead to poor response in a disaster situation. And very importantly, the factors might also be attitudinal, where people are not aware, first of all, they don't think what could be the impacts of disasters on their lives and on cultural heritage, and sometimes they think it is an act of God, and that makes them a bit complacent, and that might be another factor that would affect the impacts of disasters. So we need to consider all these aspects when we think about how our cultural heritage sites are really exposed or are at risk to disasters. So now I show you another example from World Heritage Monument Zone in Kathmandu Valley in Nepal. Now this is a World Heritage site, but again it is vulnerable, or it is exposed to several risks, including coming from earthquake, as we already witnessed in 2015. But what we need to see is that many of these risks are not only in this site itself, but maybe they are in the surroundings of the site. So maybe there are structures which are getting divided or subdivided, or maybe there are poor constructions, and so if an earthquake happens, these structures will collapse, and so the access to this site will be blocked. So it's not only by considering what is happening inside the site that we can do something. We need to also understand what's happening around the site and try and address those issues as well. And that is what I want to explain as the third principle, which is that we should think about risks originating from inside out, but we should also think about risks that lie in the surroundings and can actually affect our cultural heritage site. So, disaster risk management should address the risks to cultural heritage that may originate from inside the site or a museum or from its surrounding environment. Okay, now again, we stay on the Nepal earthquake, where again many cultural heritage sites were damaged, and this is just one of the very important site. Which actually the name of Kathmandu comes from this site, and this monument collapsed, and there were a lot of people inside the structure because there was a blood donation camp going on, and many of them lost their lives. You can see that the entire structure collapsed. Now, then when the issue came about what to do with this reconstruction of this heritage site, there were a lot of concerns whether we should only focus on the heritage values, or which will be about architecture or the design or the materials, or we should focus on improving the safety of the people so that this kind of loss of life doesn't happen in the future earthquakes. And there were a lot of challenges and conflicts. But again, this is an issue that we will always find when we deal with disaster risk management for cultural heritage sites, because we are dealing with two issues here which sometimes can be contradictory, and we need to strike a balance between them. So on one hand is the issue of dealing with human safety, which is of course very important because primarily we need to save people's life, but can we do that and totally damage these heritage values, which gives this monument the significance for the people of Kathmandu? Or can we try and see how we can balance the protection of human lives and that of heritage values? Now, this requires a bit of compromise, but this is definitely one of the challenges that we have to confront when we think of disaster risk management. And that is principle 4, that human safety is paramount for disaster risk management, and we need to actually look at saving human lives, physical assets, and even livelihoods of the people, along with saving of what we consider a heritage of significance. So that's principle 4 for disaster risk management for cultural heritage. Now let me move to the other important issue which we need to always keep in mind, and I stay again here with the example from Nepal, where when the earthquake struck in 2015, many of these water structures, which are traditional wells, very old structures, in fact were very useful for the people, because these were the ones which provided water supply, since the municipal water system didn't function, and they were of help for to save people's life. And again we found and this is an example from Haiti, where these gingerbread houses actually performed very well when the earthquake struck Haiti a couple of years back, and because of the traditional construction techniques that were there, that had been developed by the people themselves, because of the regular experience with this with the earthquakes. So what does it tell us? And let me give another example from Japan, which is where when the tsunami struck in 2011, a lot of people could save their lives because they could actually climb up on these temples which were located on the higher ground when tsunami struck. In fact, they were the ones which provided shelter to people for many days, rather weeks. And this actually shows, this is a plaque which shows how many school children were saved, and they could all go up, and therefore they survived the tsunami. So what does it tell us? It tells us that there's actually a lot of knowledge in cultural heritage, whether it is in terms of construction techniques, whether it is in terms of the traditional water systems that are available, or also whether they are in as traditional ways of managing things that communities have developed. For example, in this case, how communities really work together through their social networks, through their religious institutions. They are much more effective when a disaster strikes, rather than just formal systems that are put in place. So again, we need to really consider these factors, which is what Principle 5 states, that disaster risk management is not only concerned with passive protection of cultural or natural heritage from disasters, but also with a more proactive role. And that's something which is important for us to keep in mind, that we need to think about the positive or the proactive role that heritage can play for disaster mitigation, as the source of resilience and an asset for disaster risk reduction. So we don't have to think always that cultural heritage is vulnerable. In fact, cultural heritage has a lot of capacities or positive aspects that we need to recognize. So the other point that I want to also emphasize here is that when we think about disaster risk management for cultural heritage, we are dealing with two areas particularly. One is the area of disaster risk management and the other is the area of cultural heritage. Now these are two well-developed disciplines, but then how do they interact with each other? That is more critical. On one hand, cultural heritage should be part of disaster risk management policies, whether at the national level, whether at the local level, but there has to be another system the other way around as well, which means that there should be also disaster risk management plans that are actually developed for specific cultural heritage sites, depending on their typologies, their needs, their challenges. So these two issues have to be considered together. On one hand, how cultural heritage gets back into disaster risk management plans and policies. On the other hand, how we can develop disaster risk management which is specifically tailored for different heritage sites. And that essentially means that when we develop a disaster risk management plan for a cultural heritage, we need to think about how does that connect with the systems for disaster risk reduction, response, and recovery, and for the city or the region. So it can be at different scales. It could be the scale of the entire city or the entire region, and one has to see how your plan for your cultural heritage site is actually connecting to that. On the other hand, every cultural heritage site has a management plan or a management system that is specifically designed for that cultural heritage site, and one needs to see how disaster risk management is connecting to that management plan or management system. And that is what Principle 6 states, which is that disaster risk management should be an integral component of the regular management systems of the cultural heritage site, and therefore should be reflected in the site management plan. And then on the other hand, it should also be linked to disaster management systems and policies at local or national or regional levels. So now I want to show you another example of a collapse of a fortification wall. This was a very important fort in India, and the wall collapsed. But then when the investigation was done on why this fort wall collapsed, one found that there was a lot of rising humidity and the water was percolating inside and therefore exerted a lot of pressure on these walls. And then as a result, after a while, these walls simply caved in. Now, what was the reason for this kind of a disaster that happened? Can it be only blamed on the rains that occurred, or there were other factors? So when the investigation was done, it was found that actually there were a lot of drainage lines that were originally designed as part of this fortification, but these were all covered by the municipality, who decided to lay another water pipeline on top of that, because they had their own plan and they didn't have any connection with, or they didn't really look into how the originally, because this was the responsible for the Ministry of Culture, and that was more the responsibility of the local municipality. So what does it tell us? It tells us that we need to have coordination between different sectors. Only cultural heritage sector cannot resolve this issue of disaster risk management. We need to have a very close link of cultural heritage sector with disaster risk management and climate change adaptation on the other hand, and of course heritage conservation and management on the other hand. This means that these are the different sectors which are connected to the development itself, which have to all be related. So if we talk about the risk of flooding, it might be linked to the land use planning which is being done as part of the planning of the area around it. And that might not be the responsibility of the culture sector, it might be responsibility of another sector, and similarly for housings. But all these will have an impact on cultural heritage, and therefore coordination is really the key for an effective disaster risk management. So Principle 7 states that cultural heritage should be mainstreamed into various disaster management, climate change and development sectors. And whether we come from cultural heritage side, whether we come from the disaster management side, whether from the climate change side or environment side, we really need to make an effort to really sit together and work out a system with thorough coordination. So I take you to another example where this very important cathedral, which is in fact on the World Heritage List in Goa, was faced with a fire, and that fire damaged a very important polychrome sculpture. Now, what was the biggest challenge in this case? The biggest challenge was, yes, you would guess it right, because people would burn candles, and that was part of their rituals or their practices. And on Sunday Mass, a lot of people visit these churches, and because so many of them are there, and these candles which are lit in the open, of course, in one Sunday there was huge wind blowing, and many of these candles kind of led to the fire. Now the issue is, if we stop people from burning the candles, we are actually affecting their rituals, and in that way we are also affecting negatively their intangible cultural heritage practices. So we can't just tell them not to light the candles, and maybe they will not even accept changing over to electric candles. So we have to find a system which is kind of responding to people's religious needs, but at the same time making sure that they don't create those kind of disaster risks that like this fire that happened. And so we will find that we will have always conflicts between the needs of the heritage, whether it's built heritage needs, and the religious needs or other kind of needs which might be connected to day-to-day livelihoods or the other kind of aspirations of the people. So Principle 8 states that disaster risk management of cultural heritage is really about, first of all, recognizing these conflicts between heritage and the other areas, and reconciling them by engaging multiple stakeholders. So engaging multiple stakeholders from different sectors, from the community, is really an important area that we must consider when we think of disaster risk management. So coming to Nepal earthquake, again, we see that in 2015 there was a huge damage to many villages, many important heritage sites that were damaged. But was this the only time when this earthquake happened, or there was an effect like this when such structures just collapsed? Or there are examples in the past. In fact, there was a big earthquake in 1934, and that earthquake created almost similar kind of damage many years ago, many decades ago, which means that we are always living between two earthquakes or between any two disasters. In fact, there's a very famous book by Bernard Frieden, which is titled Between Two Earthquakes. And it is very telling, because when we create disaster risk management plans, we have to consider that we are not just dealing with one disaster that will happen once, but we are always going to respond to two events that might be spaced from each other, but we need to see how we can actually deal with three situations. The situation before a disaster, when it is not happened, or it could be a situation when the disaster is actually happening during the response phase, or when the disaster has subsided or has been over and we are in the stage of recovery and rehabilitation. But what is most important is that we need to recognize that all these phases are interconnected with each other, and we need to look at it like a cycle. And that's why between two disasters is very critical. So if there is one disaster, there's going to be another event, hopefully in the future. Maybe we don't want it, but this is the part of the fact that this area lies in an earthquake area, so we can't just say that earthquakes can be avoided. But what we need to really look at is that there is so much money that we lose in going for recovery, rehabilitation, response, or preparedness. And that is huge amount of resources. When we look at what has happened after the Italy earthquake in 2016 or any other major disaster where cultural heritage has been impacted, lots and lots of resources are spent on recovering that cultural heritage site. And again, even after spending so many resources, we will never be able to get the same thing back, because the values that are lost probably sometimes are not easy to recover. Which means that from equal emphasis to all these phases, we must give much more emphasis to prevention and mitigation. That means that we need to really work towards building back better, reducing vulnerability, for the future disasters. And that's why we say build back better, because we want that in the future we are not going to, we are making our sites so much better in terms of disaster risk reduction that there will be much less impact and we don't have to spend resources. And the last principle, principle 10, is really that we cannot look at only urban heritage or rural heritage or heritage which is on the periphery. Whenever we look at any heritage site, we need to think of the larger setting within which disasters are created. And that means that we need to have, in fact, a place-based approach for disaster risk management of cultural heritage, which is, in fact, I would say in another way, it's a territorial or a regional approach for disaster risk management. Because if we focus only on the heritage site or its immediate surrounding, we will never be able to address disaster risks. But we need to look at the larger kind of regional context within which nature and culture interact with each other and many times create those risks that need to be understood and recognized and addressed for effective disaster risk management. So let me conclude this lecture by showing you what a disaster risk management cycle for cultural heritage looks like. So it, as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 phases: before, during, and after. And then each of these phases, as I mentioned earlier, are interconnected with each other. We need to do risk assessment for all these phases, whether we talk about before a disaster, whether we talk about during a disaster, or whether we talk about after disaster. Risk assessment has to be a continuing process to be done at every stage, whether before, during, or after. And then, as we have been saying, there are different kind of measures that you may look at, like prevention, mitigation, adaptation, and preparedness, which are done before a disaster strikes. And there could be many things that we may do as part of prevention, mitigation, adaptation, and preparedness, which could be even to develop emergency response equipments, access routes, evacuation areas, creating an emergency team or a drill, conducting drills. And then during a disaster, during the emergency response phase, we can think about how to immediately protect damaged heritage, how do we make immediate damage assessment, how do we in fact rescue people, relief, provide them relief, and also salvage heritage. So there are many things that we may need to do during this phase. And then, of course, as a phase after a disaster, we need to do detailed damage assessment, think about various measures, whether repair, restoration, retrofitting, and finally think of our recovery or rehabilitation plan. So as you would see here, a disaster risk management plan for a cultural heritage site has many different components that need to be looked at before, during, and after, but not in isolation, but seen much more as connected to each other, because what you will do before a disaster will have an impact on what goes on during a disaster. What you do during a disaster will have its impact on the recovery phase after a disaster. And what you do after a disaster during the recovery phase will determine how well are you prepared for the next disaster. So that's the kind of consideration that we must have when we prepare disaster risk management plan for cultural heritage sites. So I hope that this lecture has given you basic principles and you would be able to apply them for your own heritage sites, keeping these in mind. Thank you very much.